Hi, my name is Gemma Willits, and today I will be presenting my research that I developed on the LGBTQ community in South Africa. This is where South Africa is on the map, just for some context. The research question I developed is, how does the progressiveness of South Africa's legislation contrast with the lived experiences of LGBTQ individuals residing in the country? I decided to hone in on African politics as a feature of popular culture, as this is a really prevalent problem throughout the continent today. I divided my research into 3 parts and investigated how sexual healthcare, education, and homophobic violence are impacting the experiences of LGBTQ people in South Africa today. But first I have to delve a little bit into the history of the development of marriage equality and anti-discrimination laws in South Africa. Africa has long been recognized as a place of limited acceptance for the LGBTQ community in comparison to the Americas and Western Europe. In its 2019 state-sponsored homophobia report, the International Gay and Lesbian Association disclosed that 32 out of the 54 African countries have outlawed consensual same-sex acts. South Africa has an interesting and complex history regarding LGBTQ rights as well. From 1948 to 1994, South Africa was ruled under the Conservative National Party. This period of time is referred to as the apartheid era, which by definition alludes to the separation of the South African people which occurred during this time. Leaders of the National Party passed acts banning marriage between South Africans of differing races and also pushed to enact more restrictions on same-sex relations, which was already banned under common law. As a result, gay and lesbian rights groups formed to fight against anti-homosexual legislation. When Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa in 1994, a constitution was written, including an equality clause, which established protections for LGBTQ individuals from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Later, in 2006, same-sex marriage was legalized in South Africa, which remains in effect today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about sexual health and discrimination in South Africa. The HIV/AIDS crisis, which began in the early 1980s, disproportionately affected LGBTQ individuals. This brought the LGBTQ community under a global spotlight and posed significant implications for an increase in homophobia and other forms of discrimination. Africa was particularly impacted by this crisis. In 2000, 70% of the 40 million HIV/AIDS cases were in sub-Saharan Africa. These numbers have held significant implications for the LGBTQ community, as studies have found that homophobia and HIV-related stigma persist at high levels and have been documented as a significant barrier in fighting the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Today, studies have proven that gay men are 3.8 times more likely to be infected with HIV than anybody else in South Africa, causing men who have sex with other men in South Africa to be labeled as un-African and blamed for the spread of HIV. As a result, these gay men feel different from others, barring their participation in the gay community and causing high levels of unmet needs regarding HIV prevention and sexual health services, thereby increasing their vulnerability to HIV infection. LGBTQ youth are also particularly vulnerable to stigmatization and prejudice within the South African health system. In a study that I examined, it was found that the generational gap between the youth and healthcare providers, inadequate knowledge and training of healthcare providers about LGBTQ sexuality, and healthcare affordability were 3 of the main factors causing LGBTQ youth in South Africa to fear utilizing sexual and reproductive health services. Due to this, LGBTQ students favor the use of the internet for sexual health concerns to avoid potential negative encounters they might face with health professionals as a result of their sexuality or gender identification. Next, I'm going to go over discrimination in education in South Africa. In my research, I found that the primary ways homosexuality is addressed in South African schools is through silence, religion, or through the idea that sexuality is different than homosexuality. The levels of tolerance for the LGBTQ community ranged among different teachers and were reflective of how they addressed homosexuality in their classes. For teachers who chose to be silent on the topic, this was derived from their belief that homosexuality was not a subject that concerns them and one they deemed not appropriate for the classroom. One teacher argued, "I do not think we can be really concerned about such behavior. Our main purpose is to set the person right so that one gets an education. They can then do their thing outside the school." However, others were not as tolerant. One teacher from a religious school said, We had a young man who was openly gay, and there was quite a bit of pressure from parents that he be removed from the school. We've got a very conservative parent community. At religious schools, where material is taught from a Christian fundamentalist background, findings from the study noted a large incompatibility between religious studies and homosexuality. At traditionally religious schools in South Africa, there are very limited opportunities for LGBTQ+ students at these institutions to find support from parents, teachers, or classmates. The South African educational system has established guidelines which place sexuality studies on school agendas, but these policies do not explicitly include homosexuality in the required curriculum. For the teachers included in the study who addressed homosexuality as a different concept than sexuality, this provided an excuse for them to disclude discussions about the LGBTQ+ community from their classrooms. This is not necessarily due to any personal feelings against the LGBTQ+ community, but rather due to a lack of knowledge on the topic or solutions to address it. One teacher was quoted as saying, "The government must come up and protect and be able to deal with the problems in the country. They can't ignore the situation. And how are we going to go about having strategies to deal with it?" Silence on discussions regarding the LGBTQ+ community only furthers the potential for stigma and bias and risks the safety of the LGBTQ+ community. This proves that without education about the LGBTQ+ community, the laws and protections that have been granted to queer persons in South Africa cannot be utilized to their greatest extent. Finally, in my research, I also addressed homophobic violence in South Africa. While sexual orientation-based discrimination is outlawed in South Africa, there is a culture of homophobia and stigma that still exists, causing LGBTQ+ individuals to be targeted for their sexual orientation or gender identity. In a 2016 survey entitled Progressive Prudes, published by the Other Foundation, it was revealed that over the last 12 months, about 500,000 South Africans have physically harmed women who dressed and behaved like men in public, and 240,000 have beaten up men who dressed and behaved like women. Additionally, findings from the same survey also expose that approximately 3 million South Africans say they might commit acts of violence against gender nonconforming people in the future. Perhaps the most striking statistic, though, that I found was that 70% of South African citizens believe that same-sex sexual activity is morally wrong. These numbers are reflected in the personal experiences of queer persons living in South Africa as well, where in my research I examined stories of queer people being called LGBTQ+ slurs, their homes being looted and burned, and contracting HIV and AIDS, among other dangers. To wrap things up, the history of the LGBTQ+ community in South Africa entails a complex and constant fight for freedom, which is continuing today. While substantial progress has been made in South Africa for the LGBTQ+ community, especially being a country on a continent where over half of the countries have outlawed same-sex relations, it is crucial not to dismiss the struggles and discrimination which impacts their daily lives. Throughout my research, I have learned that South African society is disproportionately designed to favor heterosexuals, and sexual healthcare services, educational institutions, and moral belief systems are just some of the factors that play into the treatment of queer persons. While the lived experiences of the LGBTQ+ community in South Africa may not live up to the precedents set by legal rulings now, it is up to the leaders of a country on all levels, whether that be government officials, parents, or educators, to intervene in an attempt to teach rising generations of young people the same values of tolerance and acceptance that they can carry with them throughout their lives. Thank you very much for listening. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions or concerns, and have a wonderful day.